top story, of course, coming from Washington. A month ago, Donald Trump told the world what he felt about the nuclear deal with Iran.
The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it, believe me.
The deal was signed by the U.S., other permanent members of the United Nations Security Council and Europe. And that happened 2 years ago. What did the agreement actually do? It was designed to stop Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. It curtailed Iran's access to materials needed to make warheads. It also dismantled Iran's plutonium approach to bomb making. It also scaled back Iran's uranium enrichment. But Donald Trump is not happy with the deal. He slammed the Obama administration as myopic for signing it, and in a short while from now is expected to pronounce his strategy on Iran. The broad elements of what the new strategy could be were broadcast by WION earlier today. This is what we've learned from our sources in Washington. Briefly, the new strategy focuses on neutralizing Iran's influence. It will seek to cut funding for the Revolutionary Guard. It will counter the threat posed by Iran's ballistic missiles, block all paths to Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons, and build regional partnerships to contain Iran.
We must not allow Iran to obtain nuclear weapons. The Iranian regime supports terrorism and exports violence, bloodshed, and chaos across the Middle East. That is why we must put an end to Iran's continued aggression and nuclear ambitions. They have not lived up to the spirit of their agreement.
Crucially, he's not expected to tear up the deal. There's been enough warnings on that score from European leaders. His own defense secretary, James Mattis, told the Senate during a briefing earlier this month that staying with the deal was in America's national interest. But Donald Trump does not want to be in position of having to tell the Congress every few months that it is abiding by the nuclear deal. He believes the nuclear deal will not stop Iran from eventually developing a nuclear weapon. 2 senators have proposed legislation that would automatically trigger sanctions in the event that Iran is in a position to develop a nuclear weapon within a year. This is called the breakout period. If this is passed by the Congress, it would remain in force indefinitely and lead to tougher inspections and limit Iran's centrifuge development. It's not clear whether the administration has enough support in Congress to get this legislation passed. Donald Trump is probably aware of that, so he'll look for ways in which he can constrain Iran without provoking the clerics into withdrawing from the deal. He also needs to do this in a way that satisfies allies like Israel and the Saudis, the American deep state, and of course his constituents. And this is the latest that we are getting from our sources in Washington, and this is breaking news we can tell you from the White House press office ahead of Donald Trump's speech, which is expected in about an hour from now. The White House press office has said that the Iran strategy focuses on constraining Tehran's aggression. The United States says it will revitalize its alliances with regional partners and work to deny Iranian regime funds for what it calls its malign activities. The statements also say that the United States will work to rally support against, in fact, for global condemnation of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. And joining us from Washington is WION's correspondent Nina Maria Potts. Good evening, Nina. We're still going through the first reports that have come out from the White House. What have you learned about what the new strategy, what the new Iran strategy is going to look like?
Well, I think it's important to separate the issues slightly. There is the unilateral action that the White House appears to be threatening against Iran, and there's also the question of the U.S.'s participation in the international deal on Iran, as you quite rightly, a deal that President Trump has again and again described as unfair to America and still posing a direct threat to America's national interests. I think whatever we hear from President Trump, and it's clear from sources very close to the discussions and the debates internally in the White House, whatever we hear from him will ultimately be a slightly watered down version of some of his campaign rhetoric and some of the rhetoric that we've heard from him since he entered office. He is heading towards, we think, decertifying the Iran deal. And just as a technicality to explain, part of the U.S.'s condition for being involved in the Iran deal is that the sitting U.S. president has to certify the Iran deal every 90 days. And President Trump has done that twice since coming into office, and he's been telling his advisors for weeks now that he does not plan to do that again. So I think we will find ourselves in a place where he passes the ball to Congress. He's likely to decertify the Iran deal in this instance. He can't call on Congress.
We'll try and reconnect with Nina there, but all right, I'm told she is with us. Nina, you were telling us that the president is most likely going to not decertify the deal, but to make it that much more difficult for Tehran to continue. And he's also talking about working with regional allies. I understand that's the Saudi Arabian regime and Israel.
That's correct, but yeah, we're likely to hear from him that he will decertify the deal, but knock it to Congress, and Congress then has 60 days to look at the Iran deal and decide what course of action it needs to take. In terms of America's sort of negotiating partners, co-signatures for the Iran deal, if we're looking at the European allies, as you remember, they were crucial to the negotiations with Iran at a time when the US was not speaking to Iran at all. And the Europeans have been calling on the US not to unravel the deal with Iran. And we understand that President Trump, although his rhetoric is fairly angry on Iran, he has been listening to those voices, and from within his own administration, people.
So that's what we've heard. The U.S. president most likely is going to decertify the Iran deal. What happens next? It goes to the Congress. Does it automatically mean that the deal is scrapped? Remember, this was not a bilateral deal between the U.S. and Iran. There were other players involved. This was an internationally mediated deal. So we're going to look into what this entails and what next for Iran. Certainly, we will be getting reactions from Tehran for you in just a bit. And we're waiting for the U.S. president to make a statement. In the meantime, let's get in our guests on the panel this evening. Jonathan Landay, national security correspondent at Thomson Reuters, with us from Washington. Raymond E. Vickery, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce, Trade Development, also with us from Washington. And Mojtaba Musavi, founder and editor of Iran's View, with us from Tehran. Good evening, everyone. Jonathan, your first reaction, was this on expected lines? It is believed, it is being reported, that the U.S. president is going to most likely decertify the deal.
He's going to throw it to Congress, which under American legislation known as the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, will have 60 days in which to decide whether or not to reimpose the sanctions that the United States was obliged to lift as part of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. However, the administration's idea is to actually amend that act with legislation that would create what they call trigger points. And those trigger points are going to be criteria that if Iran meets, i.e. we know one, which is if it gets beyond closer than a year towards being able to develop a nuclear weapon, the U.S. sanctions will automatically be reimposed. There will be no argument. There will be no discussion. There will be no negotiation. This legislation, according to administration officials, will automatically snap back the U.S. sanctions that were lifted as part of the nuclear deal, and that, if that was to come to pass, that would be the end of the deal. At least the way it appears from here, because once those sanctions go back on, you will have other countries unwilling to do business again with Iran for fear of crossing the United States Treasury Department. And so that's what we expect. We also expect President Trump, as your correspondent talked about, in fact, I know, will talk about an all of government, on all of U.S. government approach to trying to cut off the the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps from its external sources of revenues, i.e. Through front companies outside of Iran and other sources that it uses to raise funds to provide to Hezbollah, Hamas, and other Iranian-backed militia movements. That is the idea. But actually executing this strategy will be extremely difficult. There are so many moving parts. You have a Congress that has not been able to pass a single one of President Trump's pieces of legislation because the Republicans who control the Congress are so badly divided. And then, as you point out, you also have the allies who have been dead set against doing anything that jeopardizes the JCPOA, and then Russia and China, who are also signatories to the deal, who I have no doubt will not cooperate with any kind of American initiative that would jeopardize the deal in any way, shape, or form. And I think senior American officials have actually admitted that this may not work, that this may fail, and then in the end, the United States will pull out of the deal, and that to me translates as a gamble. That the administration is taking a gamble that it can address what it sees as, and a lot of people see, a lot of experts see as flaws in the deal, and that has to do with what the so-called sunset clauses, which will allow Iran to step up its uranium enrichment operations after a certain amount of time, and actually, in the end, create or establish a commercially sized uranium enrichment operation, which Iran says it needs to produce nuclear fuel for low-enriched uranium, nuclear fuel for its power plants. So all in all, a lot of balls up in the air. We're not sure where this is going to go. And again, this is an administration that really has nothing to point to in terms of major foreign policy successes. It's got a State Department that's being pared back by 28%, or at least the administration wants to cut the budget of the State Department by 28%. There are major diplomatic posts missing in the State Department. So the question is, how do you do the diplomacy, the very complicated diplomacy that is going to be required to coordinate all of this with not just U.S. allies, but they're going to have to talk to Russia and China about this as well.
Absolutely. Raymond, Jonathan has comprehensively explained to us what might follow in the event of the U.S. president decertifying the deal. What is your first reaction? And also, do you believe that what he's trying to do here is make it impossible for Iran to stay in the deal?
Well, let's be very clear about what's going on here. The president is playing to his base. He's playing to his Twitterati, if you will, saying that this is the worst deal ever and so forth. And now he's in a position as president that he's supposed to deliver on these kinds of statements. And his senior advisors are saying, now, wait a minute, Mr. President, the deal has been complied with in regard to nuclear weapons. And so decertification, destroying the deal, is not in the United States interest. Well, the president has been willing to accept that. So he's gone back to him and says, well, give me something that I can say. And so he's gone into great depth about how bad the missile program is, how bad things are that are not covered by the nuclear deal. And the outcome is sort of a compromise. It's saying, well, we won't destroy the deal. He could do that immediately by reimposing sanctions. But what we'll do is kick it down the road to Congress. And in the meantime, we'll say how bad Iran is and all the terrible things they're doing, many of which are true. but are not covered by the deal. And he's saying we're going to enforce this deal, and the IEA is going to have more inspections and so forth. Now, whether this all works or not, both to satisfy the president and his base and at the same time keep peace, is an open question. And it seems to me that India has a very strong stake in this, and working with the United States. There are many people here who understand depth and the problem here, and India, it seems to me, can play a positive role in trying to bring out of this a resolution which is in the international interest across the board.
Well, if Trump's own team, his European allies and the Congress cannot convince him, fat chance that India can. But let me take this question to Tehran. Mujtaba, the Iranian government said a few days back that all options are on the table if Trump were to not honor this deal. What reactions can we expect now?
Yeah. Actually, let me say that it seems at the moment that the United States is trying to put more sanctions on Iran to make this JCPOA meaningless for Iran. I think Trump at the end that they want to make Iran to agree with new talks, to start new talks, especially on its defense program, in its missile program. Specifically. But the point is that already the United States has shown the Iranians that they are not trustworthy, that they do not abide by the agreements they make. So if the United States wishes to take this further, then the Iranians will take a more aggressive positions. Because if we don't receive the benefits of the deal, so we have different options on the table, including walking away from the deal and going back with the greatest speed with our nuclear program. So. One of the options, as Iranian presidents told, is that Iran can withdraw. If the United States withdraw from the JCPOA, we can do the same within hours, and we restart our nuclear program. But alternatively, Iran has the options if United States do not exit the deal, but put more sanctions on Iran to make JCPOA meaningless, so we can start some nuclear-related programs that are not a violation of the deal, but they can send a signal to the United States that Iran is in a way in the path of empowering its nuclear capabilities.
Jonathan, we know what Trump's thoughts on the deal are, but we also know what his team thinks. And U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said that he and other senior administration officials have spent weeks talking quietly to Congress to thrash out some sort of an agreement to ensure that the deal doesn't collapse entirely. Is that possible, given the kind of sanctions that Trump seems to be proposing?
We'll have to wait and see on that. They have been in discussion with leadership of the Republican majority in Congress, the committee specific and especially relevant committee chairman. But I'm not sure that they've had these kinds of intense discussions with the Democrats. And let's not forget that in the Senate, the Republicans control that chamber only by 2 votes. So they're going to need all of the Republicans to stay on board this idea of theirs. The legislation still hasn't been introduced. We don't know when that's going to happen. But yes, I mean, there is no doubt that President Trump is also going to announce new sanctions on Iran related to its ballistic missile program, what the administration calls Iran's support for terrorism, human rights abuses. And I think you're going to see some fairly tough new sanctions against parts of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is Iran's kind of elite domestic and foreign paramilitary and espionage organization. There are already sanctions on the Quds Force, which is the foreign espionage and paramilitary wing of the IRGC. There are also sanctions on various Quds officials and entities and individuals associated with the IRGC. But the United States, U.S. officials, senior U.S. officials are saying they are not going to impose U.S. Financial and other sanctions on the IRGC as a whole, because let's not forget, in a place called Syria, we have hundreds of American soldiers deployed in northeastern Syria, not very far from the deployment of Hezbollah, IRGC-commanded other militia. There have been already conflicts between the two sides, with the United States shooting down Iranian drones, there's a great potential for, if the IRGC as a whole were to be sanctioned, if U.S. troops were to come in contact with IRGC on the battlefield, both in Syria but also in neighboring Iraq, that could create really serious problems. And so I think you're going to see new sanctions on the IRGC. You're going to see a new approach, or an intensified approach, by the United States to try and cut off the IRGC sources of foreign funding. But all of this is very fraught, as I just pointed out. You have places in the world and in the Middle East where American forces and Iranian-backed militias like Hezbollah, like the Hashd al-Shabi in Iraq, and IRGC command officers themselves are in very close proximity.
Absolutely.
And so I have no doubt that what we're going to see absolutely is an increase in tensions between the United States and Iran, and we simply are going to have to wait to see where all this leads to.
Indeed, we're waiting for the president to make a statement. The Iranian parliament speaker, in fact, said earlier today that Washington's withdrawal from the nuclear deal would be an insult to the United Nations. Listen in.
К сожалению, Соединенные Штаты находятся в тех условиях, при которых с такими заявлениями, конечно, они делают свой статус более, так сказать, более нестабильным. А что касается ядерного соглашения, то это не двустороннее соглашение. Это оно закреплено резолюцией Совета Безопасности ООН. Поэтому это оскорбление в адрес ООН. Но для всего этого есть у нас четкий и ясный ответ.
For months now that this deal should be honored because Iran has kept its part of the bargain. Raymond, if you can hear my voice, we know that everyone, including Trump's own team, his allies, are against the decision to scrap this deal, and yet the American president seems to be pushing it in that direction. The Iranians say that this is an insult to the United Nations. Does Donald Trump care?
Well, I think he does care because he's already moderated his actions. I mean, this summer he was all in favor of doing what he said exactly on the campaign trail, which was just to tear up the deal and withdraw and so forth. Let's be very clear, that's not happening at this point. What is happening is the deal on nuclear matters is staying in place. And so what has happened is he's been placated by being able to talk about other aspects of the relationship in regard to missiles and what the Guard does, the Revolutionary Guard does. Now, those are dangerous statements and lead to the kinds of things that Jonathan has talked about, and very serious. But it is not carrying up the deal. And if you listen closely to the people in Congress, even on the Republican side, the responsible leaders are saying, yes, well, let's really enforce this deal hard, and let's get the IEA more involved. Well, that's fine. But if you're going to really make some progress, what has to happen is that you have to have as many carrots as sticks in order to be able to reach some sort of peaceful relationship.
Mojtaba, I'm running out of time. I have to ask you very quickly, does it really matter for Tehran what is written on a piece of paper as a deal? Because it knows very well what the man on the other side, what the American president really thinks about this deal, and it all depends on his whim and fancy.
What is important for Iran is what Americans are doing and what Iran is getting from the deal. Let me tell you something about the IRGC. The Iranian IRGC, this is the force that stopped ISIS, the terrorists in Iraq and Syria. And unlike the U.S. role in the region and U.S. allies in the region who are funding terrorism, it was IRGC who stopped the terrorists here and helped to region's stability. So when United States signals that it wants to sanction and put pressure on the parts of Iran's legitimate armed forces, that is not a good signal for Iran. So how more I have time so I can go?
I'm afraid not. We have to wrap this. Jonathan Landay, Raymond Vickery and Mojtaba Mousavi, thanks very much. We are expecting a statement from the US President in about an hour from now, and we will be bringing that live to you here on WION.